It's late November, 1978. Four young employees are closing up a fast food restaurant in a quiet Midwestern town. But by morning, the restaurant is empty, the safe is open, and all four kids are gone. Tonight, Evelyn Black is exploring the chilling, unsolved Burger Chef murders. Welcome to Hooked on Homicide.
Hello, my fellow morbid darlings, and welcome back to another episode of Hooked on Homicide. If you are new here, and I really hope you are, I'm Evelyn Black, and this podcast is where you and I are going to unravel some of the most dark and twisted cases, one stitch at a time. So, without further ado, let's dive into today's cold case. Let's set the scene. In the fall of 1978, Speedway, Indiana was a quiet town of fewer than 13,000 people. As the name suggests, it was, and still is, mostly known for the nearby Indianapolis Motor Speedway. It was the kind of town where kids rode their bikes after dark, where teenagers worked after-school jobs to pay for their car insurance, and where doors were often left unlocked. But that year, a dark cloud seemed to hang over the Indianapolis area. The community had already been shaken by a string of random bombings over the summer, so people were on edge. But still, no one could have anticipated the sheer horror that would unfold on the night of Friday, November 17th, 1978, at a local Burger Chef restaurant located at 5725 Crawfordsville Road. That evening, four young employees were working the closing shift. Let's talk about who they were, because they're more than just victims. These were children with futures. There was the assistant manager, 20-year-old Jane. Jane was known to her friends and family as, quote, Sweet Jane, because of her infectious, zany smile. She was also described as reliable, hardworking, and well-liked by the franchise management. And under Jane worked three teenagers. Ruth was 17. She was a bright, driven honor student who loved math and business. She was actively saving up money, focused on her grades, and had a promising future ahead of her. Then there was Daniel, 16. Like many teenage boys in the late 70s, he was trying to figure out his place in the world, working the grill to earn some spending money. And then there was 16-year-old Mark. Mark's presence that night makes this tragedy even more heartbreaking, as he wasn't even supposed to be working. He had actually decided to cover a shift for another employee so they could take the night off. He was the youngest of 7 children, raised by strict, loving parents who instilled a deep sense of responsibility in him. At 11 p.m., the restaurant officially locked its front doors to the public. The crew began their typical cleanup routine, wiping down the stainless steel counters, sweeping the orange-tiled floors, and counting out the registers. But what happened over the next hour would baffle investigators for nearly half a century. Between 11:15 and 11:30 p.m., A 16-year-old boy and his girlfriend were sitting in their car in the shadowy parking lot just behind the burger chef. They were just talking, killing time, and suddenly they noticed two suspicious-looking white men, possibly in their 30s, loitering near a car parked near the back door of the restaurant. The teens watched them. One man was clean-shaven with fair hair, and he seemed nervous as he was constantly looking down to conceal his face from the teenager's headlights. The other man had a heavy beard. The bearded man noticed the teenagers watching them. He aggressively approached their vehicle, tapped on the glass, and asked for their identification. And strangely, after asking for that identification, he ordered them to leave the area, claiming there had been recent vandalism and they were trespassing. Intimidated by this, the teens put their car in drive and left. And that decision to drive away likely saved their lives. Just after midnight, an off-duty burger chef employee named Brian decided to stop by the restaurant. He had been out with friends and wanted to pop in to see the crew and maybe grab a leftover burger before heading home. Something that we've probably all done as, teenagers working in fast food. But when Brian pulled up, the lights were still on, which he states could be normal for crew finishing up closing duties and such. But when he walked up to the building, he found a chilling scene. He states that the restaurant was completely and eerily empty. Brian noticed the back delivery door was left slightly ajar, open by about 3 or so inches. He walked inside, and the quiet was deafening. There was no sound of running water, no clattering of trays, no chatter. He walked back towards the manager's office and found it in disarray. The heavy metal safe was wide open, and 2 empty currency bags lay discarded on the floor nearby, along with an empty roll of adhesive tape. Brian looked toward the front counter. The registers, they were open. But here's where the clues stop making sense. Whoever had emptied the safe had left more than $100 in loose coins sitting right in the cash registers. Because if this was a robbery, why would they leave heavy but valuable coins? Furthermore, as Brian looked around, he realized there was no obvious signs of a violent struggle. The tables weren't overturned, there was no blood, but resting quietly in the employee break area were the winter coats and purses belonging to Ruth and Jane. It was mid-November in Indiana. The temperature was dropping, and it was dropping fast. No one leaves for the night without their coat, and no teenage girl leaves without her purse. Brian knew that something was terribly wrong, so he picked up the restaurant phone and he dialed the police. When the Speedway Police Department arrived in the early morning hours of Saturday, November 18th, their initial assessment of the scene will become one of the most heavily criticized decisions in local law enforcement history. Officers walked through the back door, looked at the open safe, looking at the missing $581, and made a devastating assumption. Instead of treating the scene like an abduction or a violent robbery, woo, say that 10 times, the police concluded that the four kids had simply stolen the money. Guys, they are really trying to paint this as though these kids robbed their place of employment. What the F, right? Their working theory was that these four, and I quote, irresponsible teenagers had emptied the safe of the paper cash, leaving the heavy coins behind, and then took off to go partying and joyriding in the manager's car. Oh boy, you guys know where this is going. So basically, they completely dismissed all the glaring red flags. They ignored the fact that Jane and Ruth's coats and purses were still there. They ignored that Mark was a straight-laced kid who wasn't even scheduled to work that evening. And because they assumed it was a case of petty embezzlement, the police committed the ultimate cardinal sin of criminal investigations. They told the franchise owner that he can open the damn store. I told y'all, this case is going to make y'all pissed off. You'll learn to trust me on that. Anyways, on Saturday morning, the daytime Burger Chef crew came in. They grabbed mops, buckets of bleach, and rags. And guess what? They wiped down the counters, they mopped the floors, and they threw away the trash. No crime scene photographs were taken before this cleanup. The police didn't dust the safe for fingerprints. They didn't process the back door for blood, hair, or even fibers. By the time the restaurant opened to serve breakfast to Saturday morning crowds, the crime scene had been entirely sterilized. Womp womp. Years later, a Speedway police officer assigned to the case named Buddy Ellwanger, if I said that incorrectly, I'm sorry, would bluntly admit to reporters, and I quote, "We screwed it up from the beginning," end quote. By Saturday afternoon, the joyride theory completely evaporated, as Jane's 1974 Chevrolet Vega, which had been missing from the restaurant parking lot, was found abandoned and partially locked. But it wasn't found outside a party or a bar. It was found, and get this car was found about a mile and a half away, parked quietly on West 15th Street, right near the Speedway Police Department. Man, oh man. So, the kids had not returned home. Their parents were frantic. And then it finally dawned on the authorities. This, in fact, was no joyride. The four employees had been kidnapped, and precious hours and vital evidence were already lost forever. A massive, frantic search was launched. Helicopters took to the sky, and search dogs scoured the area around the abandoned Chevy Vega. But Saturday, it bled into Sunday, and there was no sign of the kids. Then came Sunday afternoon, November 19th. More than 20 miles south of Speedway, down in Johnson County, a couple of hikers were walking through a remote, heavily wooded area near Stones Crossing Road. The autumn leaves had fallen, leaving the woods bare and gray. As these hikers walked off the trail, they made a horrifying discovery. There laid the bodies of Jane, Ruth, Daniel, and Mark, and they were scattered among the trees and brush. The scene, it was an absolute nightmare, and investigators immediately realized that robbery had not been the sole motive at all. All 4 victims were still wearing their brown and orange Burger Chef uniforms. They still had their watches on their wrists, and the small amounts of cash they had in their own pockets was untouched. Daniel and Ruth were found lying side by side. They had been executed with multiple shots to the back of the head, neck, and shoulders from a .38 caliber firearm. Jane, the young manager, was found a short distance away. She had not been shot. Instead, she had been viciously stabbed twice in the chest. The force used against her, this poor girl, was so extreme that the handle of the hunting knife had actually snapped off. The handle of that knife was missing from the scene, leaving only the bloody blade lodged inside of her body. Mark's body was located about 50 yards away from the others. The scene told a desperate story. It appeared as though Mark had tried to run. He had suffered severe blunt force trauma to his head and shoulders. Investigators suspected he had been bludgeoned with a heavy chain. Disoriented and bleeding, he had crashed blindly into a tree in the darkness, knocking himself unconscious. Tragically, as he lay on the forest floor, he asphyxiated on his own blood. But when the coroner eventually examined Mark's body, they noted a crucial, terrifying detail. Some of the deep bruising on his head and body was an hour or 2 older than his estimated time of death. This suggested that a violent struggle had taken place much earlier in the night. It likely happened back at the Burger Chef restaurant, long before the victims were forced into a vehicle and driven 20 miles to their deaths. Now, with the discoveries of the bodies, the entire theory of the crime shifted. Investigators began to piece together a grim narrative. They started to believe that this was a botched robbery. The leading theory was that the robbers hit the Burger Chef, intending only to take the money. But during the heist, one of the employees, likely Mark, who aggressively fought back, recognized one of the attackers. A fight then broke out. Mark was badly beaten, and the perpetrators realized that their identities had been compromised, and they panicked. They decided they couldn't just leave witnesses behind, and they forced the 4 kids into a van or car, drove them out of the county, and murdered them. But with the crime scene at the restaurant completely sanitized, investigators were operating blind. And it's all their own doing. My goodness. So they tracked down the teenage couple who had seen the 2 men in the parking lot. And using their descriptions, police created composite sketches and even commissioned 3-dimensional clay busts of the suspects, the fair-haired man and the bearded man. Those faces were plastered all over the news. A break seemingly came a few weeks later. In a smoky bar down in Greenwood, Indiana, a man was heard loudly bragging to patrons that he had been involved in the Burger Chef killings. Police immediately dragged him in for questioning. Once sober and sitting in an interrogation room, the man quickly backtracked. This man even took a polygraph test, and he passed, denying any involvement. However, hoping to get the police off his back, he gave detectives a lead. He offered up the names of a gang of men known for aggressively robbing fast food restaurants in the surrounding counties. When police went to investigate this gang in the nearby town of Franklin, they couldn't believe their eyes. One of the gang's associates was a dead ringer for the bearded man from their composite sketch. Detectives summoned this man for a formal police lineup, but in a highly suspicious move, just hours before he was supposed to appear at the station, that man completely shaved off the thick beard he had continuously worn for the past 5 years. Suspicious. Then, to make matters even more compelling, another member of that same gang perfectly matched the description of the fair-haired man. So police at this time were certain that they had their guys. But certainty isn't evidence. Both of these men were later convicted and sent to prison for other armed robberies. But because the Speedway police had allowed the restaurant to be cleaned, there was zero physical evidence tying them to the Burger Chef. So, without a confession, the prosecutor could not legally charge them with the murders. They walked on the biggest crime of their lives. Years passed. The 70s turned into the 80s, and the Burger Chef case went ice cold. The families of Jane, Ruth, Daniel, and Mark were left in a perpetual state of agony, wondering if justice would ever be served. Then, in 1984, the phone rang on the desk of Detective Mel Wilsey of the Marion County Sheriff's Department. On the line was an inmate named Donald Wayne Forrester. You see, Forrester was sitting in the Pendleton Correctional Facility, serving a massive 95-year sentence for an unrelated rape. Word had come down that Foster was scheduled to be transferred to the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. And let's just say Michigan City was notoriously violent, and Forster, he had made some enemies. He was absolutely terrified of this transfer, believing he would be killed within weeks of arriving. So Forster told Detective Wilsey that he had a deal. Keep me out of Michigan City, and I will hand you the Burger Chef murders on a silver platter. Wilsey bought Forster in, and the inmate began to sing. On tape, Forster officially confessed to being the triggerman. He admitted to shooting Daniel and Ruth in those dark woods. But detectives were skeptical. Was Forster really telling the truth? Or was he just a desperate con artist spinning a tale to save his own skin? In order for Forrester to prove his credibility, he began offering details that had never been released to the public or the press. You see, he knew exactly how the bodies were positioned. He knew about the broken knife handle left in Jane's chest. But to test him further, detectives put Forrester in the back of an unmarked car and drove him down to Johnson County. They didn't tell him where to go, but without any prompting, Forrester directed the driver down the winding roads, successfully navigating them deep into the woods to the exact clearing where the bodies were found. Forrester laid out a complete, terrifying narrative. He claimed that the public's theory of a botched robbery was completely wrong. He said that the motive was a targeted hit over drugs. According to Forrester, Jane's brother, James, owed a substantial debt to local drug dealers. He also claimed that he and 3 other men were hired to go to the Burger Chef that night not to rob it, but to find Jane and violently threaten her as a message to her brother. But according to Forrester, the intimidation plan went well off the rails. When they grabbed Jane, 16-year-old Mark bravely intervened to protect his manager. A brutal fistfight broke out in the alley behind the restaurant. Mark was then struck, fell backwards, and hit his head violently on the steel bumper of the assailant's van. That just breaks my heart. He was a hero. Believing the teenager was dead or dying, Forrester and his accomplices panicked. The simple threat had now escalated into a homicide. So they decided they had to abduct the rest of the crew and kill everyone to completely cover their tracks. Forrester gave the police the names of his 3 accomplices, claiming they were the ones who killed Jane and Mark. He also admitted that after the murders, he threw his .38 caliber revolver into a local river. So police immediately dragged the river. But after 6 years in the mud and current, they found nothing. However, Detective Wilsey wasn't deterred. He kept digging and found another massive piece of corroborating evidence. He tracked down Donald Forrester's ex-wife. When Wilsey interviewed her, she told him a bizarre and chilling story. She claimed that just days after the 1978 murders, Forrester forced her into his car and drove out to a wooded area in Johnson County. He left her waiting in the passenger seat, walked deep into the woods, and came back just a few moments later holding several spent shell casings. She said he then drove them back to their house, walked into the bathroom, and flushed those casings down the toilet. Armed with this information, Wilsey immediately got a warrant for that house. And that house had since been sold to an unsuspecting new family. Those poor people. Anyways, detectives brought in heavy machinery and literally dug up the property's septic tank. Wading through years of raw sewage and sludge, investigators ran the contents through mesh screens. And finally, they found exactly what they were looking for. Several spent .38 caliber shell casings. This, no pun intended, was the smoking gun. It seemed as though they finally had the physical evidence needed to close the Burger Chef murders forever. But just as an arrest seemed imminent, disaster struck this case from the inside. On November 14th, 1986, someone within the Marion County Sheriff's Department leaked the highly confidential details of Forrester's cooperation to the press. And this story, it hit the papers. Suddenly being exposed, David Forrester panicked. Likely terrified of retribution from his unnamed accomplices, who were still walking free, mind you, he immediately recanted his entire confession. OMG. Ugh, I told you guys, this case is going to piss you off. He claimed that the police had fed him the details and coerced him into making the tapes. He absolutely refused to cooperate any further. So now, the prosecution was left in an impossible position. You see, Forrester had a long history as a liar and a con artist. There were minor inconsistencies in his timeline, and without his ongoing testimony to tie the shell casings and the narrative together in front of a jury, the prosecutor made a heartbreaking call. They did not have enough concrete evidence to secure a conviction. So the charges were never filed, and Donald Forrester took his secrets to the grave, dying of cancer behind bars in 2006. Wow. Decades later, the Burger Chef murders remain officially and agonizingly unsolved. Over the years, other names have popped up. As an informant named Alan Pruitt once claimed, he was almost a victim of the same killers that very weekend, but his story was highly contested and led nowhere. In 2018, on the 40th anniversary of the murders, the Indiana State Police tried one last Hail Mary. They released a previously unseen, high-resolution photograph of the broken hunting knife blade found in Jane, hoping that the unique weapon might jog a hunter's or a family member's memory. But sadly, it generated no solid leads. Despite a $25,000 reward and thousands of hours of police work spanning multiple states and generations of detectives, the killers of Jane, Ruth, Daniel, and Mark have never been brought to justice. The original Burger Chef building in Speedway sat empty for a long while, changed hands to a few different restaurants, and was eventually demolished in early 2024. The physical reminder of that horrific night is officially gone. But the victims, they are not forgotten. Today, a memorial consisting of 4 red oak trees stands tall in Speedway's Leonard Park. These trees serve as a living promise that while the justice system and the police may have failed them, the community will never let their memory fade into the dark. Well, my friends, this wraps up this week's apparent cold case, as I think that you and I both know who at least one of the perps are that committed this heinous act. But pushing that aside, I do want to encourage anyone who may know anything pertaining to this case to please reach out to Indiana State Police or Crime Stoppers. Anyways, as I'm sure you all have figured out by now, that while death may be inevitable, it does not have to be tonight.